There have been loud disagreements between the United States and Israel about exactly how to end the war against Iran. Trump has already stated that the United States has supposedly achieved its goal and is ready to wind down the military campaign, while Israel, on the contrary, says that the active phase of the war is just beginning. When the United States and Israel launched the operation against Iran last month, their statements regarding the common goal of regime change in Tehran were quite coordinated. But now disagreements between the allies are deepening. And today, the Washington Post published insider information that Trump and Netanyahu have increasingly begun to disagree on exactly how to end this war. For example, in Washington, they still haven't been able to clearly explain why they lifted sanctions on Iranian oil if, according to Trump, everything is under control. At the same time, there are more and more reports that Trump is actually determined to send ground troops into Iran. In this episode, we'll discuss how dangerous the disagreements between the US and Israel are, what they are about, and what they could lead to. My name is Alexi Pichi. Let's discuss this topic together. But before we start, I want to ask you to support the work of this YouTube channel financially, either with your donation, a paid sponsorship subscription, or by becoming a sponsor right here on the YouTube platform. Under this video, you need to click on the contact button. Or you can use the QR code on your screens. That's actually the most convenient way to make a one-time donation. I will be grateful for any support you can give, but you can do this at the end of this episode. And don't forget to subscribe to my Telegram channel Peachy News. The link is in the description of this video. There, we post breaking news as it comes in. So, the other day, the Washington Post, based on information from its sources, claims that if at the beginning of the operation against Iran, the statements from the US and Israel regarding the common goal of regime change were quite coordinated, but now the disagreements between the allies are deepening. At first, as you remember, US President Donald Trump urged Iranians to take advantage of their only opportunity in many generations to take power into their own hands. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu called on the Iranian people to throw off the yoke of the murderous regime, and recently Netanyahu again stated that Israel is now doing everything possible to help Iranians protest as safely as possible. Well, 3 weeks after the start of this war, the goals differ between Trump, who expected a quick military victory with only minor economic losses, and the Israeli leader Netanyahu, who still has grand plans to overthrow the regime in Iran. Moreover, American, Israeli, and Middle Eastern officials are already talking about this. It's no longer possible to hide this. The latest harsh statement from Trump, in which he spoke out against Israel's attacks on the major Iranian gas field South Pars on Wednesday, March 18th, revealed a certain tension between the two allies and the inconsistency of the US president's approach to this war. Trump essentially distanced himself from the attacks on the world's largest gas field, which is shared between Iran and Qatar. By the way, the latter is a close US ally, and Trump cynically stated that supposedly the US knew nothing about this particular attack on the gas field. Although earlier there was information that Trump not only knew, but coordinated this particular attack with Netanyahu, but now he says, "I didn't know anything about it at all." This incident, which caused an increase in energy prices and provoked Iranian strikes on Qatar's key gas facility and on the Saudi Arabian capital Riyadh, became evidence of Donald Trump's hesitation as he tries to manage a military operation in which, by the way, 13 US soldiers have already died. And all this pomp and self-confidence of Trump started to gradually fade away. According to American officials, Trump was impressed by the destruction the operation inflicted on the Iranian regime, while at the same time distancing himself from the catastrophic economic consequences that spread across the world. He says, "When it comes to the economy, I don't know anything about it, it's not my fault, that's not my responsibility. But when it comes to the success of the military operation, that's me, that's my achievement." I'll quote the Washington Post. Netanyahu's months-long campaign aimed at convincing Trump to attack Iran, and the accidental admission by US Secretary of State Marco Rubio that Israel's determination to strike prompted American officials. Later, by the way, Rubio stated that his words were simply misunderstood, which angered supporters of Trump's America First policy, who began to question the role of a foreign state in dragging the US into war. The Trump administration tried to change the narrative, emphasizing that the operation was solely Donald Trump's decision. But this message was undermined by the resignation of the head of the US National Counterterrorism Center, Joe Kent, who stated that they were dragged into another war in the Middle East because of pressure from Israel and its powerful American lobby. Immediately after that, Kent came under FBI investigation. For his part, Netanyahu is taking advantage of the situation to destroy his main rival. And it's hard not to notice here that the goal of regime change in Iran is reflected in Israel's military tactics. About 40% of the roughly 8,000 strikes were aimed at Iranian security forces and facilities that could be used to suppress another popular uprising. Besides eliminating Iran's supreme leader Ali Khamenei, Israel has already killed dozens of Iranian political and military leaders. However, intelligence officials from both the US and Israel admit that the Iranian regime is still nowhere near collapse. And while Israel's goals are quite clear, the goals of the US are becoming increasingly unclear. But the White House denies that Trump has allowed the scope of the war to become vague or undefined. Although his defense secretary stated that while there used to be some timelines for the war, now there are none. He says they are not defined in any way. Well, when the war ends, then it ends. As he said, when Trump decides that the war is over, he'll just come out and announce it, that's all. Although before they used to say 4 to 6 weeks, remember? Now that's it, there are no deadlines anymore. But let me quote a White House spokesperson. Unlike the years-long foreign conflicts of the past, which had no clear objectives, President Trump has defined 4 specific goals for Operation Epic Fury. The goals are to destroy Iran's ballistic missile program, sink the Iranian navy, neutralize Iran's regional allies, and ensure that Tehran cannot obtain nuclear weapons. Regarding the neutralization of Iran's regional allies, here's a question. So far, no one is touching Hezbollah, the Yemeni Houthis, or the so-called Axis of Resistance in Iraq at all. And if that's also a goal, then as I understand it, we should expect weeks and weeks of war. So, basically, will they deal with Iran first and then switch to these proxy forces or what? Nevertheless, several officials told the Washington Post that significant cracks in the US-Israel alliance began to appear in the second week of the war, when Israeli attacks on Iran's oil facilities caused clouds of toxic smoke and acid rain, and when the economic consequences of Iran blocking the Hormuz Strait began to intensify. And here's another quote from the Washington Post. Israel is conducting a scorched earth campaign with the goal of regime change, and that is not the goal of the US. Bibi wants to destroy Iran's economy and wipe out its energy infrastructure. Trump, on the other hand, wants to keep it intact. Interestingly, US Secretary of State Marco Rubio, when briefing lawmakers in Congress earlier this month, stated that supposedly the US is actually not seeking regime change in Iran. But at the same time, he didn't specify the scale of Israel's ambitions, so these goals can always be attributed to Israel. As a result, Washington eventually acknowledged the split, and here, during the hearings in the House Intelligence Committee, on Thursday, March 19th, answering a question about the divergence of military goals between the US and Israel, the Director of National Intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard, said, and I quote, "The goals set by the President of the United States are different from the goals set by the government of Israel. Netanyahu described the coordination between the US and Israel as unprecedented, but at the same time tried to avoid the topic of criticism from Trump. In response to a question about criticism from Donald Trump, Netanyahu noted that he would mention only 2 facts. Quote, fact number 1, Israel acted independently against the South Pars gas complex. Fact number 2, President Trump asked us to refrain from further attacks, and we are refraining. As a result, it got to the point where Israeli officials began to state that the overthrow of the Iranian regime and its replacement with something better is considered a desirable effect of the war, not its main goal. That's how it is. In Israel, they suddenly stated that they no longer believe there is a high probability of overthrowing the regime through an air campaign, saying that a ground invasion is needed. At the same time, in Israel, they hope that the intensity of the airstrikes will eventually encourage the regime's internal opponents to resume popular protests. At the same time, Israel expects that strikes on Iran will weaken the regime's ability to suppress potential new protests. They say that's exactly what the tactic is about. But for now, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps and its Basij wing remain powerful. And as you can see, so far no one is coming out to protest in Iran. Because everyone remembers Donald Trump's calls for protest in January and how Trump didn't help anyone back then. And unfortunately, we ended up with more than 30,000 protesters killed. Trump himself has repeatedly stated that Operation Epic Fury is a success, but he keeps changing the timeline for when and how he will announce the end of this operation. Right now, the Iranian regime remains in power, and according to estimates, let me emphasize, by American intelligence agencies, it is taking an even tougher stance than before. Meanwhile, the Strait of Hormuz remains almost closed to shipping, and according to officials, Trump is now considering a decision to escalate the war, specifically about deploying ground troops. Such a move would be politically risky for the US president, but it might be necessary to open the Strait of Hormuz or to change the Iranian regime. At the same time, Trump has stated that the US is already very close to achieving its goals in the Middle East, claiming that he is already considering the possibility of gradually reducing large-scale military operations. And this is where the coming week may reveal an even greater rift between the US and Israel. Because if the US really starts to reduce military operations and the regime remains in power, then the goals of the war will essentially not be achieved. I'll leave it at that. Share your opinions and conclusions in the comments below this episode, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, and don't forget to like the video. And let me remind you that I would appreciate any support for the work of this YouTube channel. All the links and details on how to do this are in the description of this video. That's all for now. Take care. Goodbye, everyone.